Dean Martin was spinning across the stage when his legs suddenly gave out, and he collapsed in front of 400 of the most powerful people in Hollywood. November 14th, 1953. The Copacabana nightclub, New York City. The room went silent. Every eye in that room watched Dean Martin lying on the floor, unable to get up. But here's what nobody knew. Dean wasn't drunk. He hadn't touched a single drop of alcohol that night. Something else was happening. Something Dean had been hiding for months. Something that could destroy his entire career if anyone found out. The audience started whispering. Some were laughing. Others were shaking their heads. Studio executives, talent agents, newspaper columnists. They were all there. And they were already writing Dean Martin off. In 1953 Hollywood, if you showed weakness, you were finished. If you fell down, nobody picked you up. They stepped over you and moved on. That's just how it worked. Everyone in that room expected Frank Sinatra to do what any smart entertainer would do. Keep the show going. Protect his own reputation. Pretend it didn't happen. But Frank Sinatra didn't do any of that. What Frank did next, in front of every person who could make or break a career in show business, shocked everyone. Because Frank didn't just help Dean. Frank did something that broke every unwritten rule in the entertainment industry. And the reason Frank moved so fast? The reason he didn't hesitate for even 1 second? He recognized something in Dean's eyes that night. Something Frank himself had been hiding from the world for years. What happened on that stage would start a friendship that lasted 40 years. A friendship that both men took to their graves. A friendship that neither one of them ever fully explained. But before you understand what Frank did, you need to understand what Dean was hiding. And trust me, when you find out the real reason Dean Martin fell that night, everything you thought you knew about the man they called the King of Cool will change forever. To understand what really happened that night, you need to understand what both men were going through. Because in November 1953, Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra were two of the most broken men in show business. They just didn't know it about each other yet. Dean Martin was famous, but not for the right reasons. Everyone knew him as the funny guy standing next to Jerry Lewis, the straight man, the one who just stood there looking handsome while Jerry got all the laughs. Critics said Dean had no real talent. They said without Jerry, Dean Martin was nothing. And the worst part, Dean was starting to believe them. His partnership with Jerry was falling apart. They were barely speaking off stage. The fights were getting worse. Dean felt trapped. He was making millions, but felt like a fraud. Every night he went on stage wondering if this was the night everyone would finally see through him. Frank Sinatra was in even worse shape. Just 2 years earlier, Frank was the biggest star in the world. Sold out concerts. #1 records. Screaming fans everywhere he went. But by 1953, it was all gone. His record label dropped him. His voice was damaged. His marriage to Ava Gardner was destroying him from the inside. Hollywood called him finished. Washed up. Done. The man who used to sell out Madison Square Garden couldn't get booked at a hotel lounge. Frank Sinatra was so desperate. He was begging for work. And nobody was calling back. That night at the Copacabana was supposed to change everything. First time Dean and Frank would share a stage together. A comeback showcase for both of them. The biggest names in entertainment were in that audience. This was their shot, their one chance to prove they still mattered. Backstage, 30 minutes before showtime, Dean and Frank stood in the same dressing room for the first time. They barely knew each other. Just two broken men pretending everything was fine. Frank noticed Dean's hands weren't steady. Dean noticed Frank wasn't making eye contact. Neither said anything. The curtain rose. The band started playing. And for the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. The audience was laughing. The chemistry was electric. Both men were hitting every note, every joke, every move. Then the second number began, and Dean's body betrayed him in front of everyone. Here's what nobody in that audience knew. Here's what Dean Martin had been hiding from everyone, including his own wife. Dean Martin wasn't an alcoholic. That was the act. That was the image he let people believe. The stumbling, the slurring, the glass always in his hand. It was all fake. The drink on stage? Apple juice. The wobble in his walk? Calculated. Dean created the drunk persona because it was easier than telling the truth. And the truth was something Dean couldn't afford to let anyone find out. For 8 months before that night, Dean had been suffering from a condition that affected his inner ear. Severe vertigo. It came without warning. One moment he'd be fine. The next moment the entire room would spin and his legs would turn to water. Doctors told him it might go away. It might get worse. There was no way to know. But one thing was certain. If Hollywood found out Dean Martin had a medical condition that could make him collapse on stage, his career was over. In 1953, studios didn't accommodate weakness. They replaced it. So Dean made a choice. He let people think he was a drunk, because in show business, being a drunk was more acceptable than being sick. A drunk could still get work. A sick man was a liability. Dean had been managing it for months. He learned to grip furniture when he felt an episode coming. He timed his movements carefully. He positioned himself near walls, near chairs, near anything he could grab if his legs gave out. And when he did stumble, people just laughed. Classic Dean. Always a little tipsy. Nobody suspected a thing. But that night at the Copacabana, Dean had made a terrible mistake. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He'd been rehearsing nonstop, terrified of failing in front of Frank Sinatra, a man he secretly admired more than anyone in the business. The venue was hot, the lights were blinding, and the dance number was more physical than anything he'd done in months. When Dean felt the tingling start in his legs during that spin, he knew what was coming. He had maybe 2 seconds to make a decision. Try to fight it and risk making it worse, or go down. He went down, and in that moment, lying on that stage, unable to make his legs work, Dean Martin was certain of one thing. His career was finished. His secret was out. Everything he'd built was gone. What Dean didn't know was that the man standing 3 feet away from him had already made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The moment Dean hit the floor, time seemed to stop. The band kept playing for a few bars, confused, not sure if this was part of the act. The spotlight was still on Dean, lying there on the polished stage, his legs refusing to obey him. He tried to push himself up. His arms shook. He collapsed again. 400 people watched in silence. Then the whispers started. Someone in the back laughed. A cruel, knowing laugh. Then another. A woman's voice cut through the room. He's drunk again. More laughter. Head shaking. Dean could hear every word. He could see the faces of studio executives exchanging glances. He could see the talent agents already crossing his name off their mental lists. In that moment, Dean Martin wasn't the king of cool. He was a joke, a punchline, a cautionary tale about what happens when you can't hold your liquor. Dean closed his eyes. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the stage to open up and swallow him whole. 20 years of work, 20 years of building a reputation, gone in 10 seconds. Frank Sinatra stood 5 feet away. The smart move was obvious. Keep performing. Make a joke. Distance yourself. Let Dean take the fall alone. Literally. Every instinct in show business said protect yourself first. Frank knew what everyone in that room was thinking. He knew what the newspapers would write tomorrow. He knew that helping Dean meant attaching himself to a sinking ship. Frank Sinatra had spent 2 years crawling back from nothing. He couldn't afford to go down with someone else. But Frank didn't move toward the microphone. He didn't signal the band to keep playing. He didn't do what everyone expected him to do. Frank Sinatra dropped to the floor. Right there. In his expensive suit. On his hands and knees. Right next to Dean Martin. The audience gasped. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't entertainment. Frank waved off the stagehands, who came rushing toward them. He put his hand on Dean's shoulder. He leaned in close. So close that no one else could hear what he said. And Frank Sinatra whispered 7 words into Dean Martin's ear. 7 words that Dean would remember for the rest of his life. 7 words that we'll get to in a moment. But first, you need to understand what those words did to Dean. Dean's eyes opened. His face changed. The humiliation was still there, but something else appeared. Surprise. Confusion. And then something that looked almost like recognition. Like Frank had just said the one thing Dean needed to hear. The one thing nobody had ever said to him before. Dean looked at Frank. Really looked at him. And for a moment, These two broken men saw each other clearly for the first time. Not the images, not the personas, the real men underneath. Frank didn't try to lift Dean up immediately. He didn't rush him. He sat there on that stage floor, in front of every powerful person in entertainment, and he waited. He waited for Dean to be ready. Then Frank grabbed the microphone, still sitting on the floor next to Dean. And Frank Sinatra did something only Frank Sinatra could do. He made a joke, but not at Dean's expense. At his own. Frank looked at the audience with that famous smirk and said, "You see what happens when I try to keep up with this guy? I wore him out. The man's got more moves than I've got excuses for my ex-wife." The room went quiet for a second. Then someone laughed. A real laugh. Then another. Then the whole room was laughing. Not at Dean. With Frank. The narrative shifted in an instant. Frank turned a disaster into a bit. He took the embarrassment and put it on his own shoulders. Frank stood up slowly. He extended his hand to Dean, but he didn't pull. He waited. Dean reached up and took Frank's hand. Frank helped him to his feet. Gently. No rush. And Frank kept his hand on Dean's back, steadying him. Not obvious. Just enough that Dean could feel it. Just enough that Dean knew he wasn't alone. Frank whispered something to the band leader. The whole set list changed on the spot. No more dancing. No more physical numbers. Frank had 2 stools brought out. 2 microphones. And for the next hour, Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra sat side by side and just sang. Ballads. Standards. Songs that didn't require anything except 2 voices and a band. Frank made Dean the star of every moment. Every joke set Dean up for the punchline. Every song featured Dean's voice. Frank Sinatra, the man with the biggest ego in show business, made himself the sidekick for the rest of that night. By the end, the audience was on their feet. Standing ovation, not for the performance, for what they had witnessed. They had watched one man refuse to let another man fall alone. They had watched loyalty in an industry built on betrayal. Years later, Dean would tell a reporter something he'd never told anyone. Frank didn't save my career that night. He saved my life. Because I was ready to walk away from everything. I was done. And Frank got down on that floor and showed me that someone gave a damn. That was the night I stopped being alone. But what the audience didn't know, what nobody knew until years later, was what Frank had whispered to Dean on that stage floor. Those 7 words that changed everything. And why those words meant that Frank understood something about Dean that even Dean's own wife didn't know. The show ended. The audience left. But Dean and Frank didn't move. Frank told security to block every door. No reporters. No photographs. Not tonight. He led Dean to his private dressing room. Just the 2 of them. The door closed. Dean spoke first. His voice was shaking. "Frank, I don't know how to thank you. What you did out there. You didn't have to." Frank stopped him. "I know you're not drunk, Dean." Dean froze. "What?" Frank sat down across from him. "I watched you at the Sands last month. The way you grip the piano when nobody's looking. The way you position yourself, near the curtain. I know because I do the same thing." Dean stared at him. Frank took a breath. This was something he'd never told anyone. 2 years ago, when everything fell apart, it wasn't just my career that broke. I broke. Panic attacks. Couldn't breathe. I'd be in the middle of a song, and my chest would lock up. I thought I was dying every single night. Dean said nothing. Just listened. Frank continued. "You want to know why I came down to that floor so fast? Because I saw your eyes. The terror. Not embarrassment. Terror. I've seen that look in the mirror." For the first time in months, Dean felt understood. "So what do we do, Frank?" Frank leaned forward. "We make a deal. Right here. Right now. From now on, you fall, I fall. When you're drowning, you call me. When I'm drowning, I call you. No judgment. No questions. We just show up. That's the deal." Dean extended his hand. Frank took it. Not a handshake. A promise. A pact between 2 men who had spent years pretending to be invincible. Now you want to know what Frank whispered on that stage. Those 7 words Dean remembered for 40 years. When Frank dropped to his knees and leaned in close, he said this. "I see you. The real you. Stay." 7 words. But to a man who spent his entire career hiding, those words meant everything. Someone finally saw him. Not the act, the real him. The next morning, the newspapers told a different story. Frank had called in every favor he had. His publicist worked through the night. By sunrise, nobody wrote about Dean falling. They wrote about Dean and Frank rising together. And the world never knew how close Dean Martin came to walking away from everything that night. That night at the Copacabana wasn't supposed to be anything more than a one-time rescue. Neither man knew that what started on that stage floor would become the most legendary friendship in entertainment history. But that's exactly what happened. Within a year, Dean and Frank were inseparable. They brought in Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. The world called them the Rat Pack. But insiders knew the truth. Frank and Dean were the foundation. Everyone else was just along for the ride. Their dynamic was simple. Frank was the leader, the boss, the man whose temper could clear a room in seconds. But Dean was the only person alive who could calm Frank down. Dean was the only one who could tell Frank no and live to talk about it. Because Frank knew that Dean had seen him at his lowest. And Dean knew the same about Frank. They had rules. Unspoken but unbreakable. Never let each other fail publicly. Always make the other one look good. Phone calls at 3 in the morning were always answered. No matter what. No matter where. No matter who else was in the room. They never talked about that first night at the Copacabana. Not once in 40 years. But they never forgot it either. The years passed. Dean's career exploded. Movies. Television. His own variety show. Frank became the chairman of the board. The most powerful entertainer in the world. They made films together. Performed together. Built empires. Through marriages, divorces, scandals, and losses, one thing stayed constant. When Dean needed Frank, Frank was there. When Frank needed Dean, Dean was there. No questions asked. Then came 1987. The phone call that changed everything. Dean's son, Dean Paul Martin, was killed in a plane crash. He was only 35 years old. A military training accident. No warning. No goodbye. Just gone. Dean disappeared. He stopped performing. Stopped going out. Stopped talking to almost everyone. The man who spent his life making people laugh couldn't find a single reason to smile. Friends tried to reach him. Family tried to help. Dean wouldn't let anyone in. Anyone except Frank. Frank showed up at Dean's house unannounced. He didn't call first. He didn't ask permission. He just walked in, sat down next to Dean, and said nothing. No advice. No empty words about time healing all wounds. Frank just sat there. For hours. Day after day. Week after week. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they didn't. Frank understood something that nobody else did. Dean didn't need to be fixed. He needed to not be alone. So Frank stayed. Just like Dean had stayed for him all those years ago. In 1988, Frank convinced Dean to perform one last time. The Together Again tour. Dean was fragile. Everyone could see it. But Frank never left his side. Every show, Frank positioned himself close to Dean. Just like that first night. Just in case. A reporter asked Frank why he was so protective. Frank's answer became legendary. Dean fell once, 40 years ago. I told him then, you fall, I fall. Nothing's changed. Nothing ever will. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. They said he died of respiratory failure. But people close to him knew the truth. Dean never recovered from losing his son. His heart had been broken for 8 years. His body finally caught up. Frank Sinatra was 80 years old when he walked into that funeral. Frail. Struggling. His own health failing. But he was there. He had to be. Frank approached Dean's children before the service. He pulled them aside. And he told them something he had never shared with anyone. He told them about that night in 1953. The night their father fell. The night their father almost gave up on everything. And he told them the 7 words he had whispered on that stage floor 42 years earlier. I see you. The real you. Stay. Frank looked at Dean's children with tears in his eyes. Your father thought he was invisible. He thought nobody saw the real him. But I saw him. And I spent 40 years making sure he never felt invisible again. That's what he did for me too. That's what real friendship is. Here's what made that night at the Copacabana so special. It wasn't that Frank helped Dean up. Famous people help each other all the time. It happens every day. What made it special was that Frank got down. He didn't reach down from above. He didn't manage the situation from a safe distance. He dropped to the floor. He entered the mess. He put himself at Dean's level and said, "I'm not above you. I'm with you." That's the difference between charity and brotherhood. Charity reaches down. Brotherhood gets down. Dean Martin went to that stage expecting to fall alone. Frank Sinatra walked away knowing he'd found the only person who truly understood him. They didn't save each other's careers that night. They saved each other's lives. And they spent 40 years proving that one moment of loyalty can define an entire lifetime. We live in a world that celebrates success, followers, fame, numbers on a screen. We measure people by how high they climb. But Dean and Frank measured their friendship by something else entirely. They measured it by who showed up when they hit the ground. Frank Sinatra had money. He had power. He had everything the world says matters. But at Dean's funeral, none of that mattered. What mattered was 40 years of showing up. 40 years of answered phone calls at 3 in the morning. 40 years of you fall, I fall. The question isn't whether you'll fall. Everyone falls. The question is, who gets down on the floor with you? And when someone else falls, do you reach down from above? Or do you get down beside them? Dean and Frank taught us the answer. Real friendship doesn't lift you up. It sits with you in the dirt until you're ready to stand. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share it with the person who gets down on the floor with you. Drop a comment about someone who stayed when you fell. And ring that notification bell for more stories about the real moments behind Hollywood's greatest legends. Because sometimes the most important part of a friendship isn't the celebration at the top. It's the hand on your shoulder when you're at the bottom.